All right, back again, everyone. Hope you enjoyed my two-parter on map design and map creation for world building. If you'd like me to do any further videos on more detail on the map making creation, if there's any specific things related to map making that you wanted, like I said, more information on, or even if I just can direct you to some other places to find more in-depth information, I'd be more than happy to. Like I said, I'm not an expert on cartography. I'm not an expert on geology or geography or anything like that. I just made sure to do a lot of research and to put my creative endeavors in the capable hands of someone that knew what they were doing. And like I said, the results turned out really well. But I'm always happy to, help out in whatever way I can. If people have questions, you can always leave them in the comment section. And if I can make a video in response to it and add it to this series, I'd be more than happy to. But this one is going to be another two-parter, and this one is going to be dealing with something that really is a source of a lot of confusion and a lot of heated debate, and I think needs to be dealt with. Just giving, like I said, my take on it as an individual, and that has to do with the concept of tropes. And I'm not going to do a real lengthy discussion and try to, to dissect, and come up with some like universally flawless definition of what a trope is and what a trope isn't, because I think that's only going to, contribute to the confusion and not kind of reinforce my my advice on the notion of tropes. So basically, tropes are literary, or I guess you could say story creating, not necessarily literary, because they are in, you can find them in movies and other different kinds of creative mediums, but it's they're storytelling devices, or storytelling elements, that have appeared enough times that they've kind of been given a definition, or had a term attached to them, whereas you can use it as kind of a shorthand way of expressing a concept or idea when mainly when discussing or critiquing or analyzing a piece of art, not really when it comes to like doing the creation of the art itself. The knowledge of tropes are far more important for those who want to be in the the profession, or want to focus their endeavors on critique and analysis and review of works of art, in storytelling mediums, whether it's movies or television or comic books or novels, graphic novels. The knowledge of tropes will help you to, I guess, condense information using some defined terms, to kind of get to the point and use something that most people will understand when you're trying to, analyze something, and it can save you a lot of time, as opposed to just writing out a long, big description, to explain something. You can use a trope term, which is basically, tropes are, just something that has a, a specific name attached to it. Like, for example, like say something like a red herring. I'll use it, which is a very common trope in mysteries and whatnot. So if let's say you had a story where you were doing a review of somebody's writing, they wrote a mystery, and like you said, you could say, well, the author did a really good job of incorporating the red herring trope. Well, if you know what a red herring trope is, or a red herring is, where you're leading someone purposely in the wrong direction for X amount of time in the story before there's finally a reveal that wasn't the person that committed the crime, and the criminal's still out there, and that person and they do these in like the televised, especially like, British detective shows. I mean, there's a million of them, where you'll have, a case that happens, like a murder mystery, and you'll have a handful of people at the beginning that are all, potentially the perpetrator. And, one of them may be really strongly focused on at one point through a lot of it. And then we find out at a certain point that they're really innocent and they weren't really the killer, but we were using them as a means to draw, our focus and attention away from who, the real suspect was. So, I mean, most people understand the concept of a red herring. And you can, and those of you who aren't familiar with it, if you're reading a review and somebody mentions that, well, you can go and look it up. I mean, then because oh yeah, I know what that is. I've seen that in lots of stories. I just didn't know there was a name for it, which is basically tropes in a nutshell. So if I was writing that review, I'd say they used a great, I wouldn't say, well, they did a great job of making us think that this certain person was the suspect, and then they went through all this time, and then we realized, well, that wasn't. And we said, they just did a good job of using the red herring trope. So a lot of stuff like that will help. It just helps solidify a concept and make it, like I said, make it easier to just throw that in and move on. Or something like a love triangle. People have a pretty good idea of what the concept of love triangle is. It's a trope. It has a very specific meaning to go along with that title that certain literary or storytelling element is called. That's basically what tropes are. They exist all over the place. You'll find them all over. If people have enough time, there's people have spare time, they're coming up with names for new tropes that maybe, that's something they saw that showed up uniquely in one story and that never showed up anywhere else. So if it does show up anywhere else, then they say, oh yeah, that was the such and such trope that was introduced in this book, So my advice and my basic stance on the whole idea of tropes is don't look at tropes as something negative. People confuse it far too often with cliches. Like I said, I would say, there are no rules in writing. Of course, like I said, the only rule is you have to write. But I would say, a rule of thumb with tropes is tropes are not bad. Tropes are, you shouldn't look at a trope and say, oh, and think of it in the negative, because it's really going to stymie your creative process and your creative progress, and you're going to get into that creative paralysis or writer's block kind of mindset if you're just so worried about tropes. Don't worry about them. Don't spend a lot of time worrying about whether or not you've got tropes in your story. You're going to. It's impossible not to. It's impossible to write a completely trope-free story, because the minute somebody reads it, they're going to come up with a name for one of your things you came up with, and they'll name a trope after it, and there you go. Now you've created a trope, and you've contributed to the insanity that takes place on so many writing forums where people just constantly just talk about tropes. It's like, don't worry about tropes, just write. When you revise and reread, your writing, and something kind of seems a little bit stale or a little bit uninspired or unimaginative, like it's something like you think, that seems a little too familiar. Like, I've read this too many times, maybe that's a trope you had that is commonplace, but like I said, you'll locate that stuff without having to know whether or not it's an actual trope or not. Odds are it's a trope and it's got a name for it, but don't worry about it. It's like I said, it's not a big deal. Just, get your stuff done. And when you revise, you can go back through and try to, change things up to make them seem a little bit more, commonplace, or maybe something that's, you think that is, after further review, you think it's something that's, occurred a lot. Tropes aren't, like I said, tropes are not negative, in and of themselves. So don't get all paranoid about them. Don't be worrying about whether or not you're using too many tropes or too few tropes. It's just you're going to run in circles. It's a dog chasing its tail. So don't worry about that kind of shit. It's just going to wait. You're just going to waste time. On the other hand, if you want to analyze and critique and review, as your main focus, you want to just, consume tons of different kinds of artistic expression and movies and stuff and do reviews. And you want to become familiar with some terms or common used, terms for certain, devices that are used in storytelling as a way to streamline your review process and to communicate these ideas. You doing less, using less words, basically, then yeah, it's okay. And I mean, sometimes just looking up stuff like if you take a series that you really love, like, you know, like if you're a fan of anime or you know, or a comic book series, or, you know, a television series, you know, you can go to online and just, you know, go through the different stuff, and, you know, for like a, you know, a leisure time activity, and kind of see like the names of some of the tropes associated with things. But like I said, don't worry about it. It's better to just ignore tropes for the moment, especially if you're a new writer, and just create and write and be inspired and get stuff down. You're just gonna. It's too many people come on ICN sites and Reddit subreddits just worried about tropes. It's like they become like just completely paranoid about, because they think the tropes are the same thing as cliches, and they're not. You know, those are two completely different things. A trope can become a cliche if it's oversaturates a genre, or you know, is written in a very unimaginative way, or you know. But I mean, cliches I think fit far more in with like dialogue choices and descriptions and more things like that, not actual like plot devices or things like that. You know, it's like people using the term, you know, like a moth to a flame to describe something, or you know, some kind of description, you know, that immediately stands out because it's been used so many times. We're talking more about like, you know, prose and description or dialogue and things like that, not necessarily literary devices. So yeah, don't worry about tropes. Just get your writing done. You know, come up, brainstorm your ideas, get them down, write them, and worry about that stuff later. Because there's always going to be somebody that. And another thing to worry. If you're getting advice and critique on your work, and all they start doing is say, "Oh, you're using all these tropes," it's like, you know, that's not really helping, because then they're trying to make themselves look like they know what the hell they're talking about. So yeah, and like I said, don't spend too much time worrying about critique you're getting on message forums and subreddits from people that don't even have a book published yet. Like I said, it's you're going to get a lot of conflicting advice, and it's going to waste a lot of your time. So don't worry about tropes. Tropes are not bad. Don't spend more time just, you know, not worrying about things like that, because you're just going to, you know, you're going to work yourself up to a point where you can't move forward because you're so worried about, you know, every little thing in your story somehow, you know, breaking some kind of a weird rule because you're using a certain literary device. You'll get to your manuscript finished first, and then go through the revision part of it when it's all finished, and then you can start looking at those things a little bit deeper. But get your writing done, get your manuscript finished, and then go on to the more analytical part of it. You know, you got to have something there on paper or on your word processor file that you can work with. Otherwise, you're just going to sit there pulling your hair out, worrying about whether an idea is good or not, or, you know, remember and like I've said, you know, it's not whether it's good or bad, it's the positives and the negatives. And that's what I'll actually do with this second video. I'll do another, you know, interactive or whatever you want to call it thing, where I'll put up I'll probably create a PowerPoint presentation, and I'll go through some of my characters that I'm creating for my fantasy series, kind of bit by bit, and I'll try to, you know, through the creation process, and they're, you know, kind of designing them, I'll bring up the ideas of certain tropes to give a better definition of them, and apply them, and show the and then, you know, go through my kind of my approach of the positives and negatives, and the, you know, the way things out, so you can think in that way without being too, you know, worried about the concepts of tropes themselves. And that way, I'll, you know, like I said, I'll go through my thinking process when I'm designing some of my protagonists and antagonists, and you know, characters like that. And I'll take, you know, tropes by their term or by their name, you know, as defined, you know, like on websites, and break it down a little bit, so it'll become a little bit more easier to understand without having to get so, you know, kind of frazzled about tropes in general. But yep, that's about it. Like I said, I'll have that tropes video out pretty soon. That's it for now, guys. I'll talk to you next time, and get back to writing, and hope you're doing well. Take it easy.